Hi, I'm Rebecca Modrak. I'm a professor in the Stamp School of Art and Design and chair of the Faculty Senate. And welcome to the 34th Annual Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture on Academic and Intellectual Freedom. Our esteemed speaker today is Dr. Judith Butler, distinguished professor in the Graduate School at the University of California, Berkeley. They will be presenting a lecture entitled Academic Freedom in a Time of Destruction, Reconsidering Extra-Mural Speech. In January 2024, the Texas State Legislature passed a law prohibiting state public institutions of higher education from establishing or maintaining DEI offices. Academics working on the topic of equity and diversity had to shift their research underground, and the University of Michigan became a sanctuary for some scholars, sponsoring them, providing them with email addresses, and access to research materials. It seemed that this sheltering of fugitive scholars by unshackled institutions would be the future of academia. And I felt a considerable degree of comfort and safety at the time to be housed at an institution like the University of Michigan, where diversity, equity, and inclusion are heralded as core values. How much has changed since January? The regents are now engaging in overreach, pressuring administrators to punish pro-Palestinian students and their supporters. The ghost of Chandler Davis, and I'm sure he's a kind ghost, was undoubtedly mystified by the naive security I felt last year. He knew that there's a difference between professing values and fighting for them when under attack. Dr. Chandler Davis was one of the human sacrifices made by this university to the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1953, when young politicians eager for power and influence, like Richard Nixon and Joe McCarthy, saw an opportunity to scapegoat academics for political gain. When subpoenaed by UAC during their 1952-53 Michigan tour, Dr. Davis refused to answer political questions, invoking the First Amendment to challenge the constitutionality of the hearings in courts. He was ordered to serve a 6-month sentence. The majority of the faculty in the two committees appointed to consider Dr. Davis's future at the university turned on their colleague, conducted a shabby, evidence-free inquisition, and found him guilty of deviousness. President Hatcher recommended his dismissal. The regents denied severance pay. For those of you inspired by Dr. Davis and concerned about present-day attacks on higher education and the activism of resistance, I'd like to highlight an upcoming publication by my colleagues. In the spirit of H. Chandler Davis, Activism and the Struggle for Academic Freedom, a collection of essays by Dr. Davis and other scholars arguing against censorship, anti-protest policies, neutrality statements, the policed campus, and other enemies of speech, is being edited by Professors Michael Atzman, John Cheney-Lippold, Gary Krenz, and Melanie Tennelian, and will be published by Disobedience Press in 2025. This lecture series is named for Dr. Davis and the two other University of Michigan faculty members, Clement Markert and Mark Nickerson, who were all suspended from the university for declining to answer UAC's questions about their political affiliations. Markert, an assistant professor of biology, was eventually reinstated and gained tenure. Davis and Nickerson, a tenured associate professor of pharmacology, were both terminally dismissed. In 1990, the Senate Assembly chose to honor these three faculty members by establishing the Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture on Academic and Intellectual Freedom. At the same time, the Senate Assembly established the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund to support the lectures under the leadership of Assistant Research Scientist Emerita Peggy Hollingsworth, a former SACUA chair. In 2018, a Senate Assembly committee was established to carry the effort forward. This year, the members of the Davis Markert Nickerson Academic Freedom Lecture Committee put their heads together to identify the 2024 speaker to illuminate our present condition. We deeply appreciate their work. The committee co-chairs, Michael Atzman and Nick Tobier, will moderate the question and answer session during today's lecture. It is my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Lori McCauley, who is Provost and Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs at the University of Michigan, overseeing the university's academic and budgetary affairs. During her tenure, the Office of the Provost has created new focus areas as identified by faculty groups and the strategic visioning process, resulting in inaugural vice provostolial areas of sustainability and climate action and undergraduate education. Provost McCauley is an active researcher supported by the National Institutes of Health for more than 25 years. I welcome Provost Lori McCauley.
Thank you, Professor Modrak, and thank you for your partnership with the Provost's Office in the many ways that you're supporting faculty over your year in your role, so thank you. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the Davis Markert and Nickerson Lecture. What a great vibe in the room and an amazing attendance. I think this could be an all-time record, and so it's great to see that. Today we gather not only to remember the legacy of Professors Davis, Markert, and Nickerson, but also to reaffirm values that underpin a university's purpose in a free society: the right to inquiry, free expression, and free dissent. These rights are not mere formalities. They are the foundation of a vibrant, searching, and inclusive intellectual community. As you heard from Professor Modrak, this lecture was created in 1990, but the ideals it celebrates are as old as academia itself. The journey to uphold these ideals has not been without challenges. During the Cold War, for instance, McCarthyism cast a long shadow, and many institutions, including our own, at times faltered. The House on Un-American Activities Committee sought to frame academic freedom as a matter of national security, distinguishing between ordinary dissent and the advocacy of communism. In this climate, Professor MIT Dirk Strook was famously indicted for conspiracy to overthrow the government. MIT President James Ryan Killian didn't mince words, offering one of the era's most compelling defenses of academic freedom. Quote, "It is less dangerous to allow a few communists to proselytize in America than to allow the fear of communism to cause America to relinquish or distort or weaken basic civil rights." Killian, like many of his peers and the namesakes of this lecture, understood that academic freedom safeguards against the pressures of fear, misunderstanding, and ideologic conflict. It's far more crucial and expansive than any single threat that may endanger it. Our tradition of protecting academic freedom and fostering open discussion is deeply rooted in the belief that truth emerges through fearless inquiry. Walter Bagehot in 1874 described this process as court of inquisition, sitting perpetually investigating truth and error. If ever this freedom is curtailed, Bagehot warned, we risk stalling this court's deliberations and stifling potential discovery. The quest for knowledge, while slow and sometimes uneasy, relies on the right to dissent and challenge prevailing norms. John Stuart Mill, in his seminal work on liberty, warned that silencing an opinion because it is unpopular assumes that the dominant view is infallible. Even ideas we deem wrong may contain elements of truth. that are worth examining. Without such a dynamic, Mill cautions, we sacrifice the entire moral courage of the human mind. Academic freedom not only guards our intellectual diversity, but nurtures the courage to think critically, to risk the unconventional, and to face opposing views. The University of Michigan strives to uphold these principles. We defend the extramural speech of our faculty, recognizing that academic responsibility and personal rights are not mutually exclusive. Faculty members maintain their rights and duties as citizens, scholars, and community members when they join our institution. The right to question, critique, and even challenge our own institution forms the backbone of an environment that welcomes diverse perspectives and fosters genuine growth. As we welcome today's distinguished speaker, Judith Butler, we do so with deep appreciation for their significant contributions to the discourse on academic freedom and extramural speech. Their work exemplifies the principles we honor today. And now I would like to introduce Gail Rubin, Professor of Anthropology and Women's Studies, who will introduce our speaker. Professor Rubin received her PhD in anthropology from the University of Michigan in 1994 and has been teaching here since 2003. As the author of groundbreaking articles on the politics of sex and gender, Professor Rubin is considered one of the methodological luminaries of feminist and related theories. I'm eager to listen and learn today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Gail Rubin to introduce our speaker.
How's the volume on this? Is this okay? Okay, good. Thank you, Provost Macaulay, Professor Modrak, Sakua, the Davis Markert Nickerson Committee, and all of those who established this lecture series and who have kept it going for all these years. And thank you for giving me the honor and privilege and actually the delight of introducing Judith Butler. It's especially fitting that Professor Butler is here for this year's lecture in the aftermath of the recent election and its resonance with the conditions 70 years ago that led to the firing of the professors, the faculty, in whose memory we gather here today. This lecture was intended to serve as a reminder of what those times were like, the damage that they did, and the necessity to resist in similarly treacherous times. We clearly are in such a time, one in which not only academic freedom, but all of our freedoms are endangered, and higher education itself is in considerable peril. But while this lecture series has kept memories of the Red Scare alive, it has never addressed the anti-gay witch hunts which were a major feature of that period, including here at this university. To be clear, in 1990, when this lecture series was established, very few people knew about what has come to be called the Lavender Scare. Although it has now been well documented by historians, this period of anti-gay activism by federal, state, and local authorities is still relatively unknown. But from the late 1940s until well into the 1970s, an extensive and pervasive anti-gay crusade took place. Gay people were subject to arrest and imprisonment. They were barred from many forms of employment, and they suffered from widespread and legal discrimination. Investigations to find them, fire them, arrest them, and send them to jail were frequent. And one of the ironies of our current period is that Florida, the state of Florida, was a particular epicenter then as now. From 1956 until 1965, Florida went after communists, civil rights activists, and homosexuals, and librarians, teachers, and university faculty were special targets. And here at the University of Michigan, there was a series of arrests for homosexual conduct that resulted in the expulsion of probably about 24 students and the forced resignation of at least one faculty member. At Smith College, 3 professors were fired after arrest for possession of homoerotic publications. Like the Red Scare, this Lavender Scare wrecked lives and careers. Just as these remnants of the Cold War were finally being dismantled, a newly organized anti-gay mobilization emerged, starting in 1977 in Dade County, Florida, after which there was an electoral campaign to get rid of a local ordinance that forbade discrimination against gay people. But it passed, and so these protections were overturned, and after that, many other municipalities voted to maintain and legalize anti-gay discrimination. In 1992, the state of Colorado amended its constitution to prohibit any laws that would protect LGBTQ citizens from discrimination. And in the election of 2004, George W. Bush and many Republican candidates ran against same-sex marriage. That was the year that this state of Michigan passed a constitutional amendment forbidding not just same-sex marriage, but civil unions. It is clear that we are now in another period of anti-queer politics, although the primary target is now trans people and their medical care. Anti-trans advertising was a major feature of the recent electoral campaigns, and it's interesting being in a swing state. I got so many robocalls telling me that Kamala Harris was spending taxpayer funds to get sex change surgeries for illegal immigrants. It was pretty wild. So attacks against LGBTQ populations and institutions are once again part of a broader anti-democratic, oligarchic, male supremacist, and racist mobilization. And that's one of many reasons why Professor Butler is such an appropriate person for this year's lecture. Dr. Butler's most recent book is Who's Afraid of Gender? I recommend it. It's a masterpiece that traces much of the development of this current political and social constellation and the centrality of a garbled but potent category called gender theory. The book delineates the trajectories of these ideas, fears, and misinformation that have constituted this strange aggregate. The book shows how this extremely weird category of gender theory is one of the solvents. It's a kind of potent solvent that brings together resurgent racism, male supremacy and misogyny, class war, assaults on queers, climate wreckers, Christian nationalists, and a worldwide movement toward fascism. And the book accomplishes this ambitious agenda with Butler's customary analytic precision and a breathtaking level of erudition. Professor Butler is one of the most influential and well-regarded academics of the last 40 years. Their first book, Gender Trouble, is still a bestseller. And since then, Dr. Butler has published on a vast range of topics in over a dozen books and innumerable articles, and would take the rest of the afternoon to list all the awards and honors that Butler has received. But in addition, Judith Butler is a courageous public intellectual who has spoken out repeatedly against injustice and persecution. I've been to a lot of these lectures since I came back here in 2003 to join the faculty. And the last time I saw the hall this full was when Noam Chomsky came to speak. And I was thinking about the similarities between these two figures. They have some things in common. One of them is impeccable scholarship and being distinguished leaders in their fields of study. But in addition, both are committed public intellectuals, and both are exemplars of uncommon moral, ethical, and political bravery. Criticism of one's work will always come when it's influential and has impact, but there is the usual give and take of academic discourse. And then there is the way that in the current global political insanities, an intellectual and their body of work can become caricatured and turned into targets of rage. Judith Butler has become such a lightning rod, often attacked by people who have no idea of the actual contents of their work. Under such conditions, it takes unusual fortitude, determination, and frankly, sheer guts to continue to bear witness to one's ideas, one's opinions, and one's convictions. So as a scholar, as a public intellectual, and as a moral force, Judith Butler is a role model for these very troubling times. So please join me in enthusiastically welcoming Professor Butler to the University of Michigan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here. I also want to thank the people who are doing signing, really wonderful. And I want to thank all those who organized this lecture and my visit to the University of Michigan. I've already had several interesting conversations with faculty and students alike. I'm also, of course, daunted to be here, since, as you know, the question of academic freedom has become an acute one, both at this institution and many others during this time. Academic freedom is under attack, and so too are constitutional rights. And my task today is to think about the relationship between the two. I hope to do this in such a way to demonstrate the importance of academic freedom to living in a constitutional democracy, and for the rethinking of what democracy is and can be during this time. That is no small task, but I hope to make some headway with you today. I think we must all become aware of the consequences of the recent presidential election for constitutional rights and for the very future of democracy. The American people have, by a clear majority, voted against democracy, but they have done this through an electoral process that is part of democracy, even indispensable to its operation. And yet the people can and have opposed democracy, exercising their popular will in order to elect someone who has promised to destroy the balance of powers, to initiate mass deportation, and to undo constitutional protections step by step. The president's power will be augmented by the Senate and, yes, the House, but also by the Supreme Court, which, with its current extreme right majority, has already started to relinquish its own power to check and to balance. Several questions emerge for us to think about in this time. Democracy is ruled by and of the people. But who are the people? Which people have become the people, especially now, given that 35% of eligible voters did not cast a ballot? Democracy is not reducible to its parliamentary form, and yet those who seek to undo electoral institutions are clearly seeking to undo democracy. This is the paradox, not the contradiction, with which we are now confronted. The Electoral College, for instance, has always been a defense against the powers of democracy, even as it is in the US one of its parliamentary instruments. It's an example of an anti-democratic parliamentary institution charged with the task of undoing democracy in the name of its defense. That too tells us that as indispensable as parliamentary procedures are to democracy, they are not enough to secure its future. Democracy also occurs in fugitive and wild forms that are not captured by the vote and are certainly not represented by those who, through becoming elected, seek to strip the rights of those who assemble and speak for justice, for those who deserve to apply for residency or citizenship, for those who are working at a wage that leaves them without housing, with unpayable debt, subject to economic forms of terrorism. When the shock is done, we will, I think, look around and ask, what are the communities we might serve? What bonds of solidarity can we now make? What practices of radical care and support can we offer? It is a bind of extraordinary proportion when the will of the people proves to be against the will of the people. We can, in this electoral aftermath, despair of democracy, or we can seek to renew it in a new form. And for that we need a new imaginary, built from the potentials imminent to everyday practices of solidarity, including the encampments and the protests, the struggle for the unhoused, the struggle against prisons, against the violence at the border, and against genocide and the complicit powers that aid and abet its operations. We have as well every reason to be concerned about attacks on higher education, on intellectual life and open inquiry, a value shared by academic freedom and democracy alike. Shared governance is, as you know, a central component of academic freedom. It names, I quote from the AAUP, the responsibility shared among the different components of the institution governing boards, administrations, and faculties for its governance, and specifies areas of primary responsibility for each component, end quote. To say that responsibility is shared means decisions that affect academic life should be made through consultation with faculty and meaningful engagement with their views. Academic freedom stipulates that faculty have primary responsibility for the curriculum, what is taught and how, but also to engage in research on topics they deem valuable, to review and hire faculty to be consulted on student life, which relates to the educational process. I understand that the regents of the University of Michigan have been rightly censored by the faculty here for failing to consult and engage faculty in calling on the police to arrest protesters, for allowing donor influence to override sound academic and administrative decisions, not only in unleashing police on campus, but charging students who are exercising expressive rights for criminal acts. No matter where we stand on particular issues of the day, we should all stand for these principles. For without them, there are no protections against illegitimate intervention and eventual control of matters of academic concern by state powers, donors, administrators, and corporations, and other external powers. We used to add religious institutions. I think we should say that too. So I just said we should say where we stand. And so I made an assumption that we are each free to say where we stand on issues of the day. But are we? I said say where we stand, but I implied as part of saying expressive freedoms of various kinds, including signs and banners and acoustic forms of communication, even the use of existing infrastructure as a platform for messaging. Can we take those kinds of freedom for granted? And how do we understand and defend those freedoms when they take place on an academic campus? Some rights are, of course, constitutionally protected in the US, such as speech, affiliation, and assembly. And though constitutional rights are not the same as academic freedom, the matter of extramural speech appeals both to a constitutional right and to a precept of academic freedom. When institutions of higher education summarily dismiss or suspend faculty on the basis of their political viewpoints, they not only violate the precept of shared governance, but engage in retaliation against faculty for exercising their right to extramural speech. And I presume that as part of shared governance, there would be faculty review if and when somebody is proposed for termination. Today, I hope to show that the relation we take to academic freedom, especially the protections afforded extramural speech, have direct implications for how we think about constitutional rights of expression. More than that, however, our very ability to preserve academic freedom has consequences for preserving democracy, especially during times when both are being undermined and dismantled at alarming speed. Now, academic freedom is generally understood as a collective right that belongs to faculty members who work within academic institutions. It is guaranteed by conventions adopted by those institutions, which means that when conventions are violated or suspended, academic freedom dissolves as a right. It exists only as long as the conventions by which it is defined remain binding. The doctrines that lay out its precepts cannot guarantee that its principles will be enacted, although the AAUP retains the power to censor, and that casts a bad light on non-compliant institutions. Once institutions adopt those doctrines, they alone are obligated to make sure that these principles remain binding. The University of Pennsylvania chapter of the AAUP puts it this way, and I quote, "Academic freedom is only as strong as the institutions, procedures, and professional norms that faculty members established over the last century to protect it," end quote. That seems true, but it is not the weight of history alone that guarantees its strength, since those conventions have to be enacted repeatedly to remain binding. Even if they are a thought from the past, that past becomes alive again in a present when conventions are defined and rearticulated in light of new circumstances and challenges. In the US, academic freedom has been defined and redefined by the AAUP, which has since 1940 defined it this way. It's a freedom of a teacher or researcher in higher education to investigate and discuss the issues in his or her, their academic field, and to teach or publish findings without interference from political figures, boards of trustees, donors, or other entities, end quote. So academic freedom has always been distinguished from free speech. Academic freedom is a right that faculty have to design their courses, pursue their research, according to the expertise they have in certain fields, and to exercise that freedom either within a sphere of established expertise or in a critical relationship to it, and to conduct both teaching and research free from the intervention of administrators, governments, and donors. Free speech, on the other hand, refers to all constitutionally protected speech. Academic freedom, however, is tripartite. The first two forms of freedom are exercised in the making of curricula and the pursuit of research. But the third part is a freedom from external interference, which means a protection against retaliation. And in that sense, it is a privative freedom. It stipulates what universities cannot do to faculty. These restraints and protections are no less essential to academic freedom than the first two forms, and they each secure one another. The rights to extramural speech are forms of protection for faculty against institutional punishment for the public expression of their views. Extramural speech takes place outside the walls of the classroom, and it secures the right of faculty to express their viewpoints, in that sense, exercising rights of citizenship and free expression, on any number of issues of common concern without fear of retaliation, including censorship, suspension, and termination. So today I'm reflecting on how the consensus on rights to extramural speech has become increasingly challenged this last year. And I hope to show how the definition of the extramural as a form of speech to which faculty are entitled is linked with a student's rights of political expression, even though student expression is not explicitly covered by principles of academic freedom, but rather by constitutional rights. That faculty right makes no sense without a commitment to expression and debate on campus, to protecting rights of free speech more generally, implying that the idea or mission of the university is, at least in part, to contribute to democratic culture and entails a commitment to protect constitutional rights. In general, the extramural refers to a dimension of academic freedom not given as much attention as it should be, and which emerges for us now as a pressing issue. One can see by the etymology of the term that potential ambiguities abound. Extra-mural, outside the wall. But what constitutes the wall within the contemporary university or college? Is it a firm structure, a porous figure, a legal fiction? Does the wall designate space outside the classroom but still on the campus? Or does it designate space outside the campus, a more generalized public sphere, or specific jurisdictions adjacent to universities or including them? Where's the wall in the space of the virtual classroom? And what about universities whose extension courses, called extramural curricula in the UK and elsewhere, confound the idea of the university as walled space? Conversely, prison universities, often conceived as extension programs, are extramural and hemmed in by walls. Part of their aim, as many programs maintain, is to find an opening through and beyond the prison walls, even to prepare for a life after leaving them, and so it is conceived as a passage through the wall. Depending, as it were, on the absence or presence of walls or the kind of boundary setting at issue, we cannot always tell what kind of expression belongs inside the classroom and domains of research, and what belongs to extramural speech. In writing this paper, I wondered whether I would be rallying for a political cause, analyzing a contemporary situation, or even writing a publishable piece. I was thinking about the inside-outside distinction, but also riding that ambiguity between intra and extramural to make my point. Indeed, for the distinction between intramural and extramural to make sense, we have to assume that the speech a faculty member utters in a classroom or research setting, or even an academic lecture, is generally considered to be distinct from speech uttered as a citizen in a non-academic space and for a more general public purpose. However, the same utterance can be made within the classroom and outside its literal or virtual walls. Further, many of us actively put pressure on this distinction, seeking to link academic work with public issues, which is all the more reason for understanding extramural expression as part of academic freedom. Indeed, many laudable efforts are underway not only to more firmly link universities with the communities they serve and the communities who are already clearly inside their walls as staff, faculty, and students, but to show that universities not only serve the public good, but have a distinctive contribution to make to democratic life, especially when democratic values and institutions are under threat or indeed at risk of dissolution, or are poised to come into being for the first time. In a time when many of us are trying still to make the case for the importance of the humanities or the university itself for public life or for democracy, we have to speak both as faculty within institutions and people who belong to a common and public world seeking to participate in the charting of its course. In making public our scholarship, we participate in both domains, and we do so for the good of the university and hopefully the world more broadly. Our obligations are thus dual, intramural and extramural, and part of our job is to facilitate the reciprocal passage between them. Of course, the entire idea of the extramural is more stipulative than literal. One does not have to find a wall to distinguish between the freedom exercised by faculty in academic settings and the freedom of speech that takes place outside those settings. And yet we would be foolish to discount the power of the figure. Considered as a figure, the wall is transposable. It carries traces of both the city-state and the nation-state into the domain of the university that is supposed to be distinguished from the former, even protected from it. Indeed, we might say that the wall is decided or erected every time extramural speech is distinguished from academic speech. Its literal absence opens a contestation among various powers about where to find that wall and how to define it. Its literal presence does not always answer those questions. We tend to think of the distinction as one decided by a legal authority parsing what kind of speech belongs where, and whether that speech is protected, thereby drawing the line or building the wall. But let us remember the extramuralists of Northern Ireland, for whom writing and etching on the walls of the city were ways of calling the legal jurisdiction of the British into question. No authority backed or protected their extramural speech. Of course, that notion of extramural is not the same as the one referenced by academic freedom, but is there really no relation? A faculty member can speak against their own university. In that case, they expect that their extramural speech will not be punished by suspension or termination. But the extramural walks a line, or maybe it is one way. We all become aware of the line we walk. In Northern Ireland, extramural has referred to images and pictures on the outside of the walls that calls for the dismantling of the colonial regime, as I mentioned. We find those in Palestine as well, where the No Walls movement transfigures the surface of the separation wall, or apartheid wall, into the occasion for calling for the dismantling of the wall. The art prefigures an opening that the surface of the wall currently forecloses, and yet it uses the surface of the wall to call for its dissolution. The extramural is one way of reflecting upon the wall itself, or proceeding without the assumption of enclosure. Consider the extramural studies efforts in Mumbai, where all students are outside the walls, where the educational setting is without walls, making extension teaching into the norm. Or take the People's University set up in the spring of 2024 at Columbia University's encampment in support of Palestine, where faculty taught courses, including one course on the history of atrocity, in the encampment itself. Was that intramural, extramural, authorized, protected? Of course, universities are not always separated by literal walls from the cities or regions in which they exist, though some are very walled, recalling fortresses, ramparts, or the guarded boundaries of nation-states. Wendy Brown tells us that there are echoes of sovereignty in nearly any wall. The murus in Latin is a defensive stone wall meant to keep the enemy out, but also translated into English originally as a rampart, a term awash with military intonations of defense. Brown writes, and I quote, "Walls signify, inter alia, desires for containment and security, responding especially to the powers that declining political sovereignty has unleashed," end quote. She advises us to think about boundary drawing and wall building as a defense against every kind of waning sovereignty from subjects to states. The wall comes to symbolize a lost power at the same time that it defends against the realization of that loss. Her argument is that wall building is oddly ineffective, since the entity that seeks to be walled off effectively confesses that it is already saturated by the forces it seeks to keep at bay, including transnational migration, flows of capital, and the multiplication of non-sovereign powers, including economic ones that rival or defeat the sovereign claims of state power. In her view, wall building and boundary setting more generally are driven by a fantasy of resurrecting political sovereignty under conditions in which transnational economic flows are, in fact, exercising greater power than the state itself. I take this kind of wall building to be a fierce, if not furious, form of nostalgia that suppresses the complexity that has already undone the sovereignty at stake. Indeed, this kind of furious nostalgia in the face of an irreversible loss drives several restorative fantasies in contemporary authoritarian and fascist movements. And it may well help us to explain the recent elections. But today I mean to ask, what relation does this account of walling have to the predicament of extramural speech in our time? All right, let me retrace my steps briefly. Rights to extramural speech depend on certain ideals of campus life, namely places where open debate on issues of common public concern can take place. Although extramural speech extends beyond the campus and throughout public and digital spheres, those expressive spaces outside the classroom, but still on campus, specifically serve the educational mission of a college or university as a site where public issues can be openly debated. As we know, extramural speech can be regulated by time and space considerations, and sometimes those administrative procedures can effectively displace or suppress a gathering or a lecture. But can the rights to speech and assembly on campus still be secured through recourse to rights and obligations pertaining to extramural speech? Or are the very conventions of academic freedom now imperiled by those who understand the administration of the university as a project of risk management, keeping funds coming from donors who need to be placated, allying with the state, enlisting its prosecutorial powers, or cozying up to elected officials with the hope of some largesse coming its way? And can we understand the permission that so many administrators have given themselves to unleash, or regents, sorry, we need to distinguish sometimes, to unleash police powers on those seeking to exercise rights of speech and assembly on campus as an example of a rationality that substitutes risk management, the protection of private property, and the demands for hypersecurity for a commitment to academic freedom, including the protection of extramural speech? And what, again, is that latter? Well, nothing less than a firm pledge not to retaliate against faculty who express their constitutionally protected viewpoints. It's not just that the distinction figured by walls changes according to location and purpose, but that walling, which recalls some history of a defensive military past, becomes a new way of militarizing the campus when risk management experts decide that the costs are too high to allow protests, or the brand of the university will be tarnished, or donors and government funders will be driven away. The rationale that supports the very mission of the university, what links universities to democratic life more generally, is thus replaced by one that is concerned with calculating risk, importing litigation concerns, market values, and neoliberal concerns with cultural capital at the expense of educational ideals, or the obligation to keep debates on campus open to matters of shared public concern. The defense of extramural speech is meant to ensure that faculty can opine on matters of public concern, that their knowledge can be useful for a broader society, trusting that they will not suffer retaliation or reprisal for making an offering to public knowledge, even when it turns out to be profoundly, if not caustically, critical of the university and its financial structure and investments. But when the main questions become whether or not faculty speech, speech on campus, and public speech jeopardize or deplete the reputational value or standing of the university, or offend donors, or activate zealous right-wing politicians, academic freedom is at risk. And so too is the mission of the university. And this happens, of course, when regents who donate money to those tasked with law enforcement call upon those very powers to suppress the constitutional freedom of students. For speech that is protected by the Constitution in the U.S. context can also be speech that is protected against retaliation on college campuses, at least when faculty are doing the talking. In other words, in my view, faculty and students alike should be protected against reprisal at universities for exercising a constitutional right of expression. The expression at issue is thus both extramural and constitutionally protected, deserving, that is, of double protection under the law and the doctrine of academic freedom. What often gets lost from view is that the fundamental rights associated with extramural speech form the basis of the argument that universities have something to offer a public world organized by democratic values and debate. Or even more emphatically, extramural speech is the way that universities can both model and demand open and critical inquiry precisely on those occasions when democracy itself is at risk. This kind of thinking happens both in the classroom and in the shared spaces of the campus where protest and public expression take place. And when punishment and criminalization threaten public thinking on matters of shared and urgent concern, as the situation in Palestine surely is, then speech, including speech on Palestine, becomes the litmus test for rights of expression essential to keeping democracy alive. A defense of the fundamental precepts of academic freedom for our time is urgent and necessary if we seek to demonstrate a living link, if not a covenant, between the task of the university and the prospects of democracy. The Canadian Association of University Teachers cite Matthew Finken and Robert Post, who argue in their book, For the Common Good, Principles of American Academic Freedom, that extramural speech is the most theoretically problematic aspect of academic freedom. They claim that, and I quote, it implicates faculty expression that is not necessarily connected to academic expertise, nor to one's position within the institution, end quote. In other words, faculty, untrained in certain areas, are still free to opine about those areas or other areas outside of the classroom without intervention or reprisal. Now, the Canadian Association remarks, and I quote, it is linked to the general right of all citizens to express their views, but they do not exactly tell us what that link is. They concede that extramural speech is often confused with the Canadian Charter right to freedom of expression. But extramural academic freedom isn't just freedom of expression, it is a specific protection prohibiting universities and colleges from acting against academics for their political expression. Well, we may be tempted to say, with Robert Post, that, quote, freedom of extramural expression refers instead to speech made by faculty in their capacity as citizens, speech that's typically about matters of public concern and that is unrelated to either scholarly expertise or institutional affiliation, end quote. But that's complicated. Is being unrelated to scholarly expertise part of an exclusionary definition of the extramural? If I'm an immunologist who has something to say about disease and I teach it in my classroom, if I speak about it in public, I seem to have an authorization by virtue of my academic standing. But if I am opposing a war in Ukraine or in Palestine, or if I'm taking a political point of view on Sudan, am I still an academic making a point that is unrelated to my scholarly expertise, and does that make it extramural? In other words, am I still within the intramural when I speak from my field, and do I immediately become extramural when I speak outside my field? I think Post left open the possibility that only speech unrelated to one's expertise would fall under the definition of the extramural, which would be odd. But perhaps he affirmed that any speech should qualify as long as it belongs to matters of public concern. It is unclear. I will ask him. What if one is a Middle East studies professor who teaches material one way in the classroom but takes bolder stances outside? Is their speech in the second instance still intramural, or is it now extramural, ideally accompanied by that double protection? But if the former is the case, then extramural speech does not include those situations in which faculty members speak about their expertise in public in order to make that expertise more broadly useful to ongoing public debates. Indeed, one argument made against Stephen Salaita, who was denied a position at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana after a series of tweets opposed to the bombardment of Gaza in 2014 were brought to light, was that those tweets should be considered to be an extension of his academic knowledge of the field or his position, and that, therefore, it could somehow be inferred from the content of his extramural utterance that he must certainly be an intolerant instructor, that he would demonstrate intolerance in the classroom. So critics such as Professor Carrie Nelson from that same institution, who once paradoxically held a leadership role in the American Association of University Professors, thought that Salaita should be removed from his faculty position since he had lost protections under extramural academic freedom provisions by speaking about his own research topics in the public domain. So he was still an academic. He wasn't protected constitutionally. Implied was that if Salaita spoke in public about his area of expertise, his utterances were professional discourse and not constitutionally protected. His tweets were treated as intramural, and the wall was brutally drawn to lead to his loss of employment. Indeed, the AAUP did not take its guidance from Carrie Nelson in that instance, undertook its own investigation in the spring of 2015, and found that Salaita was unfairly deprived of his position and that the University of Illinois deserved censure. Indeed, his speech in public was extramural and constitutionally protected, and his teaching practices were supported by positive evaluations, which is the only possible basis for such a decision. He himself should have been protected against retaliation and termination. I mentioned that we cannot, through inspecting the utterance alone, decide whether it's intramural or extramural. These are not specific kinds of speech acts. We can't make a typology of them. We might, for instance, give an assignment in a classroom to consider 3 versions of the future for the Middle East. Come up with 3 versions and argue for them. We might pose that very question as part of an extramural debate in a public setting, like to a large audience. Hey, can you come up with 3 versions of what peace in the Middle East would look like? What should it look like? What would be its component parts? In other words, the same utterance can occur in both contexts, and the context is what distinguishes the 2 otherwise fairly identical claims. Indeed, we can say that public speech is constitutionally protected unless it's uttered by a faculty member who risks their job as a consequence of the utterance. When speech becomes subject to a possible punishment or retaliation within the university, that protection of extramural speech should be activated. Indeed, the speech is defined as extramural to the degree that one needs protection against reprisal and retaliation. Indeed, it is the threat of reprisal, the possible threat of reprisal, and the necessity to block it before it happens that distinguishes extramural speech from constitutionally protected speech. Talk becomes extramural when it's met with a possible or extramural reprisal, as when, for instance, Minouche Shafik, the former president of Columbia University, names in front of a congressional hearing the faculty she's willing to fire or suspend or punish summarily, circumventing shared governance, also publicly damaging those who she names in this way. Or when Danny Shaw from CUNY is fired from his faculty position after 18 years of service, after a vicious spate of online harassment, or Amin Hussein, fired from NYU after being interrogated on his statements considered anti-Zionist, a case that shows the full damage of the overbroad IHRA definition that includes anti-Zionism as an instance of anti-Semitism. It was introduced. Anti-Zionism was a political debate we had. It was introduced as an instance of anti-Semitism in the 1970s, to the surprise of most Jewish people. And some of us are still surprised. Or as a consequence of an alumni letter that garnered 6,000 signatories last November, Muhlenberg College terminated tenured professor Maura Finkelstein, who I realize has been here recently, from her position in the Department of Anthropology for expressing what the college newspaper called pro-Palestinian sentiments. Professor Mohammed Abdu was terminated at Columbia. Professor Catherine Franke is being investigated for extramural expressions she made. Former board president of the Center for Constitutional Rights, and which now form the basis of a possible decision for suspension and termination for her. The situation is not helped by the fact that the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education, in its review of the Finkelstein termination, sorry, I made her more German before, review of the Finkelstein termination, maintained that social media posts by a professor outside of the classroom can create a hostile environment for students, thereby preventing them from benefiting fully from a school's educational program. There's a lot to be said about how hostile environment has been remobilized during this time, right? It was, I think, introduced as part of sexual harassment law and then moved into Title VI and now is being used in this way. Okay. Extramural speech thus loses its protection in all these instances. Retaliation against faculty for expressing their constitutionally protected speech becomes ground for termination. Shared governance is in each of these situations also overridden. We see this breakdown of extramural speech happening all the time, and with it, I would suggest, the link between extramural speech and basic democratic freedoms and protections. Every time speech is threatened with censorship or the speaker is suspended or threatened with termination because of expressions deemed politically controversial or unfit, the extramural protections are lost. Of course, there are always exceptions to this blanket protection. But when, and we might disagree on what constitutes hate speech or what constitutes threatening speech, we may be glad when an overt racist is checked by the university. I understand all that. But what I want to call attention to is that when the exceptions start to proliferate in a certain pattern, or unfounded conjecture serves as a quick alibi for inviting the police onto campus to quell speech in assembly, then the protection becomes a joke, proving to be too easily honored in the breach or when no courage is required. At such moments, when the administrative obligation to protect speech in assembly are lost, so too is the link that universities claim to have to open public debates that are central to democratic deliberation, culture, and futurity. So when retaliation takes place, institutions are destroying the rights they are meant to protect, but also indirectly showing us why academic freedom links the task of the university to democratic ideals. In other words, on campuses, speech on matters of common concern, which includes political expression, is not just protected by the state as a First Amendment exercise, but by the university. Indeed, academic freedom obligates universities to stop themselves from engaging in reprisal. It is the obligation of self-restraint imposed by universities who sign on to academic freedom. The struggle to demonstrate the link between academic freedom and democratic life is not undertaken by faculty alone. For students, contributing to public debates on campus is part of the learning experience, and their participation in open debates along with faculty constitute the sense of the campus as a place where debates on matters of common concern can happen without interference, including police action, without reprisal, including suspension and dismissal. Those debates are meaningful precisely because we assume that the entire community is entitled to contribute. And to the extent that this ideal of campus life, this campus debate, is presupposed and furthered by academic freedom, it implies that students should have access to this same kind of activity and that it's part of the general educational mission of the university that coincides with the exercise of what, in the US at least, we understand as a constitutional right. Open debate on campuses is part of that educational mission. Universities praise such open debate as valuable for students and consider it as part of their own educational mission. So though students do not have academic freedom under the doctrine, strictly speaking, they do have rights of free speech that overlap with faculty rights or are presupposed by them. After all, faculty speak with students as part of campus debate. Faculty could not exercise their own right to political expression free of the fear of reprisal. They could not exercise their own right meaningfully if students were not part of the conversation, or for that matter, unprotected adjuncts and staff. Yes, sir, because the adjuncts are without this protection, right? We're talking about faculty, but we're also talking about tenured faculty. Adjuncts do not have the same protections under academic freedom. The rights of students are thus presupposed by the rights of faculty to the degree that participating in open campus discussions is a faculty right, but they cannot do it meaningfully without students doing the same. It's valued, even understood to express the task of the university because it exemplifies and contributes to the realization of democratic ideals. If campus speech is valuable because of its contribution to democracy, then why would it not be true for all those involved in campus discussion, the entire community, including staff? When Michael Barabay argued in 2009 that academic freedom is the struggle for democracy, he said academic freedom is, italics, the struggle for democracy. That little copula proved to be enigmatic. It seems that academic freedom is a requirement if democracy is to be realized, but what are the conditions of possibility for academic freedom? If its conditions of possibility are absent, then the exercise cannot be freely undertaken. Barabay then, some years ago, remarks upon a crisis of liberal democracy. But is it liberal democracy he wishes to preserve, which gives priority to individuals and their rights? Or is he possibly gesturing toward another kind of democracy that would emerge from the crisis in the liberal version he names? Indeed, too often, debates on academic freedom assume a background of liberal democracy, but without noting the necessity of an enduring, reproducible infrastructure of the university. Can we have democratic principles without the material or institutional conditions that make them possible and effective? How, for instance, do we understand the appeal to academic freedom in which such political and institutional structures are not in place or have been destroyed? I've tried to write about this elsewhere, calling for a transnational doctrine of academic freedom that would be responsive to parts of the world in which academic institutions have been dismantled or violently destroyed or never had the chance to be built, or where the appeal to free thought and inquiry as a fundamental right emerges inside the walls of prisons. Huma Hudfar, who was detained in Iran's Evin prison, made a plea at the 2017 Congress of the Humanities and Social Sciences for academic freedom as a transnational right. And this was elaborated after she gave a series of seminars to the guards, tasked with interrogating her about her research on women's issues in Iran. As you may know, she committed her teachings. She would lecture them as they tried to interrogate her, and then she was not allowed to use a pen, so she committed her teachings to memory by drawing with her hand invisible lecture notes on the wall of her cell. Talk about walls. Talk about intramural. Like the ultra-muralists or extra-muralists in Ireland, or those whose political graffiti now covers nearly every inch of the separation or apartheid wall in the West Bank, the structure that limits freedom of expression becomes the occasion for its call. And in the years since her release from prison, Hudfar has challenged academic communities to understand the crucial relation between academic freedom and the resistance to authoritarian regimes, including regimes that are making their way towards authoritarianism through democratic structures, which may well be our own. She objects to considering academic freedom exclusively as an individual right. And she writes, and I quote, "It is now well established and accepted that academic freedom by its nature is a collective right. While we have worked to protect this right in the various institutions, we have failed to define who is in this collective and what are the boundaries of this collective. Is it our institutions? Is it our national boundaries? Or is it, she hesitates, a borderless and global right, end quote. That was 2017, and Hoodfar was rightly concerned with active repression of academics in Iran and Turkey, both. Although a human right, academic freedom does not belong to the individual as such, but to a collective of scholars and teachers whose contours are not fully known in advance. Joan Scott cautions against regarding academic freedom as a human right. What kind of freedom is academic freedom, is the title of her essay, even though her view does not differ radically from Hoodfar's. Scott writes that academic freedom is a specific freedom that refers to the collective rights of those engaged in the dangerous pursuit of knowledge production. Dangerous because it challenges established authority, whether of the sciences or the state, end quote. And Scott adds, academic freedom is not a human right. We may want to argue that human rights depend on academic freedom. We can do so only if we redefine human rights in terms of collective well-being, something better referred to as the common or public good, with the state no longer the sole representative of the public. Scott references the AAUP, but their protocols assume that existing institutions have adopted academic freedom as a central value, implying that there are social and institutional conditions for its exercise. How would we appeal to academic freedom when those conventions have been destroyed or are otherwise absent? In Scott's view, there can be no public good without freedom of inquiry, and I agree. Further, the inquiry in what the public good ought to be is itself a public good. Hence, if academic freedom is convention-bound, does it fall away? Does it disappear when those conventions are destroyed, or when the infrastructures supporting those conventions are no longer there, or when academic activity is targeted by the state as an internal enemy, or when the infrastructural life of academic institutions is fully dismantled? The form of destruction at issue in these cases is not the censorship or punishment of this or that faculty member, something we should all still be absolutely concerned about, given the rise of new forms of censorship and punishment. The issue in this case is the dismantling and defunding of educational institutions and the physical destruction of all educational institutions, as we see in the Israeli military destruction of Gaza's universities. So in these cases, we're contending not just with abrogations of academic freedom and the repression of students on campus, sometimes violent repression, as you know, but what the United Nations now refers to as scholasticide in Palestine. Scholasticide is, and I quote, the systemic obliteration of education through the arrest, detention, or killing of teachers, students, and staff, and the destruction of educational infrastructure, end quote. And as of this date, over 85% of all educational institutions in Gaza and 100% of all universities, as well as the Central Archives of Gaza, have been destroyed and will be further destroyed if the ban against the UNRWA holds. Those United Nations statistics, furnished by the Special Procedures Unit of the Human Rights Council, document that tens of thousands of students have been killed. At least 650,000 students have been deprived of their classrooms. The UN rightly notes that the human right to education has been violated, but also that the future itself has been destroyed. Quote, when schools are destroyed, so too are hopes and dreams, end quote. Oxford University professor Karma Nabulsi, who in 2009 coined the term scholasticide, puts it this way, and I quote, the systematic destruction of Palestinian education by Israel counters a tradition of Palestinian learning and education that assumed critical importance in an occupied society in which freedom of thought posits possibilities, opens horizons, in clear contrast with the apartheid wall, the shackling checkpoints, and the choking prisons, end quote. Here, the wall and the checkpoint barriers signify the closing of horizons, the arrest of mobility for Palestinians, and the antithesis to education as a movement beyond walled existence. Scholars Against War posts on its website the fundamental principle of Raphael Lemkin's definition of genocide, which includes the undermining of the fundamental basis of the social order as a key military aim. Building on the legal precedents articulated by this Jewish-Polish jurist, Nabulsi defines scholasticide as the effort to eliminate the role of education as part of that fundamental basis of society. Neither say exactly what the fundamental basis is, but Nabulsi makes clear that education provides a critical function in society, by which she means a way of imagining beyond and against existing limits. This critical function is fundamental to society, and it is attacked when whole societies are attacked. So in contrast to the conventionalist account of academic freedom with which I began, those formulated in 1940, democracy and citizenship cannot be assumed as the abiding context for the exercise of academic freedom. Huma Hutfar exercised her academic freedom in the prison that was punishing her for speaking out or for pursuing her research in the way that she chose. Education provides or can provide an opening to ideals that any future democracy should realize, a way of imagining against the boundaries that separate a population from the possible realization of collective self-determination or emancipation under conditions of siege, occupation, bombardment, and genocidal military aims and tactics. One of those ideals that gets cultivated through education is free speech itself. Another is open inquiry, conducted under conditions free of retaliation. Scholasticide, the killing off of educational institutions, is considered by Nabulsi to be a war waged against thought and imagination alike, or rather, the structural, a structural violence that seeks to achieve those aims. Scholasticide reminds us that academic freedom presumes a range of infrastructural conditions and adjacent overlapping forms of freedom. They must first be in place for the exercise of academic freedom to be possible at all. We know this in dire but less drastic ways from the de-departmentalization of ethnic studies programs, Africana studies, gender studies, the legislative attacks on its legitimacy, the censorship and explicit prohibitions of DEI programs and discourse in some states, the attacks on critical race theory, poorly and noxiously construed, and on so-called gender ideology, poorly and noxiously construed. In effect, one cannot be in favor of academic freedom without calling for the infrastructural conditions that make it possible, without linking the destruction of programs and departments to the dismantling or destruction of universities themselves, with serious effects on academic freedom. Academic freedom is less an individual or even a collective right from this perspective, though it can take both forms. Academic freedom requires the condition of possibility for the exercise of shared or collective freedoms on the part of educators who seek to defend freedom in the world, a defense that assumes material and ideal forms at once. I have in these remarks suggested that the very distinction between infra and extramural forms of speech depends on campuses and walls, the demarcation of localities that defined the boundaries of the university, and walls that seek to separate one kind of speech from another. If we're fighting to rebuild the educational institutions destroyed in Gaza, or even more locally, to reclaim the spaces that used to house eliminated departments or programs or student associations, or if we are fighting for the freedom to think, speak, and learn, then extramural speech takes place against and beyond the mural, the wall. Academic freedom, as it's been conventionally defined, presumes that extramural speech is the speech of citizens. But if citizenship has been suspended in prisons, or if there has never yet been citizenship for the people of Gaza, what follows? What if calls for citizenship or political emancipation from systemic racism and genocide are the examples of extramural speech made by educators in the region? Those are calls to take down the wall that represents the bar on citizenship itself, a form of speech that demands to speak freely. And as such, it is an extra-conventional call for the right to education, right? If you're without a university and you call for the right to education, you're calling for that right without an institutional structure backing your call. You're calling for an institutional structure to be built and to be maintained and to be rebuilt so that once built, academic freedom can be secured. So there is no academic freedom, thinking about it infrastructurally, without the right to education. The right to education might be the extra-conventional call for an academic freedom supported by conventions. The reasons we support academic freedom for faculty commit us, again, to students, to protections for students as well. And it commits us as well to the ideal of linking what happens in university to what happens in the practices of democracy within public life. If, as the AAUP chapter at the University of Pennsylvania maintains, the right of faculty members to freedom in extramural speech is speech on issues of general concern made as a member of the public, and students are part of that public, then it follows that students also ought to enjoy that same freedom. The exercise of that freedom is thus a prerogative that belongs to a university campus community, even defining that sense of belonging. That contrast between academic and free speech depends on citizenship, which means that the state is assumed to guarantee such freedoms rather than dedicate its powers to its destruction. And that guarantee is withdrawn when police enter campuses to suppress freedom of expression and assembly. So if extramural debate on campus is an essential part of the educational mission of a university, and debates and expression on controversial and painful issues are precisely those that campuses need to sponsor and protect, then we should ask what happens to both the right to education and to academic freedom when police are brought in not only to suppress a critical viewpoint, but to assault and arrest those who have exercised their right to expressive conduct on campuses. The police assaults on students and faculty have taken place at UCLA, UNC, Dartmouth, Wisconsin, here at University of Michigan, Emory, Humboldt State, Northeastern, Columbia, Wesleyan, and Arizona State, and a number of other campuses are authorized by administrators who are attacking essential elements of education itself, if not the kind of critical thought that upsets donors or rattles the sense of the status quo that some students have enjoyed at the expense of others. Of course, the allegation of anti-Semitism is always one that is to be taken seriously. When I first heard a critique of Zionism at the age of 21, I was so disturbed, I was so alarmed, I couldn't believe anyone was talking that way. I wanted to throw a bottle, I wanted to leave the room, I wanted that person to leave the room. I was unsafe, felt myself to be unsafe. I argued, I left, I was sweating. It's like, how could anyone have a critique of that state? That is the sanctuary I was taught in my synagogue with my family, those who had lost many people in the Nazi genocide. I was taught that's our security, that's our future, that's our freedom, and anyone who opposes that is somebody who doesn't want us to live. Now, it's not like I could tell you that that was a belief that I was taught. That was a belief in my being, in my body, in my framework, in my whole orientation. When you're brought up in the crucible of a Zionist family like mine with a very traumatic, hideous history of genocidal loss, it's the structure of the world, right? It's not even a debatable belief. It's the structure of the world, right? So I went to university and I got disturbed. I was made to feel unsafe. I was like, and some of these folks were Jewish. It's like, right? I could have fought them off. I could have thrown things. I could have sued them. But instead, I did something which I guess was brave or maybe slightly unhinged. I started to read. I started to read lots of books. Some of them by Israeli historians, some by Palestinian scholars, poets, novelists. And I read, and my views changed slowly over time. But I actually understand the students who say, I feel unsafe. I understand them. But you know what? Sometimes the safety we take in a point of view that has become the consensus, when that consensus is now being challenged, we have to be rattled. We have to be disturbed. We have to realize that we thought everyone agreed with us, but actually there were whole parts of the world, including especially the Palestinian world, that did not agree with us and have different histories to tell. So we shut ourselves down, or we listen. We learn. We might even learn another language so we can understand better. We sit through conversations that are really hard to sit through, and we do not leave. We allow ourselves to hear. It was hard. I'm telling you. This was not easy. The allegation of anti-Semitism is serious. We need that allegation to have integrity, because there are anti-Semites, and a lot of them just felt very happy about this election. But we should not allow the charge of anti-Semitism to silence legitimate questions about the state of Israel. How is it founded? Through what exclusion? Through what dispossession? What are the structures of its law? Do they resemble apartheid? What is its history of colonization? How is that history continued? What was the Nakba? Is it the Nakba that is continuing now in what is reasonably called genocidal action? We shouldn't take reference to occupation or genocide to be a sign of anti-Semitic belief or ideology. The Jewish religion predates political Zionism by several thousand years, and Jewish people have always maintained a variety of viewpoints, some very critical toward the very specific version of political Zionism that established Jewish sovereignty in Palestine and linked the founding of that state with massive dispossession of Palestinian people from their lands and homes. The Bundists opposed that, as did the cultural Zionists, who thought that territory and sovereignty would actually ruin the idea of Zionism, which they took to be a spiritual ideal. More importantly, those members of the Jewish community who claim to feel unsafe on campus should be prepared to differentiate between anti-Semitic slurs and threats, something we should oppose, as we would oppose all forms of racism, and legitimate questions raised about land, violence, dispossession, and inequality. To be anti-Zionist is not necessarily to call for a violent destruction of the state or the people. It could just mean calling for an international conference in order to transform the state structures currently governing Palestine into a constitutional democracy where all inhabitants share in equal rights of self-determination without discrimination on the basis of race, religion, or national heritage. That is not a violent call. That is a straightforward liberal call. It's a call for a radical democracy and the way of achieving it through nonviolent means. But the problem is when the state of Israel tells us that it represents the Jewish people, all the Jewish people, and we accept that view, then any critique of the state is a critique of the Jewish people because the two have become interlocked by that state, right? And any proposal for a different state formation is considered no less than the destruction of Jewish life. But hey, maybe Jewish people would be safer and happier living on conditions of equality with the non-Jews who live on that land. Maybe that is the only way towards safety for all the people in that land. A true democracy may well be the best path forward toward decolonization and a nonviolent mode of cohabitation. Ideal, yes, and probably impractical, but hardly a hateful or violent vision. Jewish values have comported with democratic values in the history of social justice movements, and they can do so again as we think about new forms of political self-governance that belong equally to all the people of the land. You can get arrested for saying such a thing. The freedom to conduct a critical examination of such issues is what institutions should safeguard. Do students even know the array of political organizations and alliances in Palestine right now, or do they just know Hamas? Do they know the history of Zionism and its Jewish critics, or do they assume all Zionism is all one thing? If we were to establish a more capacious understanding of this issue, one that does not immediately occupy the terms of war, but establishes perspectives, historical and futural, beyond and against war, we would certainly be contributing to furthering an understanding of our shared world, fulfilling an educational mission. But that can't be done without critically attending to the institutions tasked with safeguarding that freedom. Educational institutions are obligated to bear criticism of their own conduct, including their investments in corporations that support apartheid and genocide. And however paradoxical it may seem, universities must also protect those who protest the university's investment policies as unjust. That is the obligation that follows both from academic freedom and constitutionally protected freedom. And when administrators succumb to trustees, donors, or state powers that seek to suppress, punish, or assault those who are criticizing war, violence, and they do so, and injustice, they fail both obligations, and the future of freedom, in its many senses, is imperiled. At stake in all of this is not just a freedom from reprisal, but also a freedom to imagine, one that requires future time or makes a demand on futurity from the situation in which it appears to be destroyed or replaced with the corrosive and endless beat of trauma and the daily struggle to exist. In some ways, the demand to rebuild the universities of Gaza is the right to walls that safeguard academic inquiry, that protect against intrusion and destruction, to secure the possibility of the future of freedom, of imagination, of thought. Within Nabulsi's definition of scholasticide is included the destruction of the sense of future that open inquiry implies. An inquiry cannot be open without a future that is open. Open inquiry is one way to create that very sense of an open future. And opening the future is what Nabulsi tells us is fundamental to any society. Scholasticide is the murder of the future. But so too is the shutting down of those voices speaking out against injustice and violence. Open inquiry has become a dangerous business because we do not always know in advance to what conclusions it may lead. And in a way, its openness, the futurity it makes possible, are not always calculable or predictable. And this, too, is one sense of freedom, one that takes the very risks that the managers would seek to still. They fear the courage of those they seek to manage, and they know that the consensus they seek to mandate is one that is already gone. Perhaps it is only through courage that a new kind of freedom can take hold, one that eludes the capture of those who would call upon the police to crush a freedom struggle. Thank you. Thank you.
we do have a little time. Thank you so much, Judith Butler. We have a little time for questions. So we have 2 microphones. If you'd like to ask a question, if you would just line up to the mic on either side, and then if there are questions that come in online on Zoom, I can take those as well. So please come to the mic if you have a question.
Anybody want to talk to me? We can't let it be. Oh, go ahead.
Thank you so much for this talk. It was invigorating and motivating. And I, among so many other aspects of what you said, I really appreciated your attentiveness to the specificity of word choice and the etymological implications that those words have. And I'm curious, in reflecting on this, if you have any opinions about the increased use of the word militant in union organizing. That is something that is occurring here on campus with our graduate student union, a call to be more militant in their organizing. And I have heard that language in, broader unionization efforts as well. And I'm curious, as we reflect on forms of violence and where we can be proactive in pushing against forms of repression or suppression of speech, what is incumbent upon us as we select our words in that pushback?
I see. Militant is interesting as a term because in France, when you call someone a militante, it just means they're an activist. It doesn't mean they're violent or they, go after property or anything like that. And indeed, there is such a thing as nonviolent militancy, which I think is a way of describing a tenacious, frontal confrontation or a practice of that. So militant does not necessarily mean military, nor does it necessarily mean violent tactic or violent action. But it seems to me worth having a public discussion about, if that's allowed. Right? It's precisely that. Like, why not have a discussion about tactics and methods, the ethics and politics of tactics and methods? We all are going to have to think about that. We are all actively thinking about that, what to do now, what kind of risks certain people are taking by showing up or assembling or protesting, how to support people who do take those risks, how to battle the retaliatory mechanisms that are becoming normalized across institutions of higher education. But I guess I would say it's worth reflecting on, because militant can go in several directions. But maybe you're hearing it as shorthand for violent resistance, and then people who are in favor of that also very often disagree among themselves about violence against property, violence against persons, or there's a long left debate on that. My own view, which is I think not popular at this moment, is that the methods we use should prefigure the world we want to realize. Because we might think we can have a violent method, and once we realize that world through the violent method, the violence will fall away. But that violent action is also making a certain kind of violent world, or even possibly making the world more violent. So then we have to ask, do we want to live in a world that's more violent or less violent? And my general answer to that is less. But that is not a popular view. And I'm out of sync with the times, but sometimes that's helpful.
Good. You want me to go?
Hi.
Hi.
wow, I'm nervous. I used you in my graduate work. You were amazing then, you're amazing now.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So my name is Jessie Beal. I'm the director of the Spectrum Center, which is our gender and sexuality center on campus.
Wonderful.
Yeah. And the center that I was an undergrad in was actually the one that was shut down by the law in Texas, right? UT Austin, right? And I find myself in a difficult space as a staff member, lacking academic freedom,
That is correct.
regardless of whether or not I publish or do original research or anything, which I do all of these things, right? Regardless of whether or not I'm all but dissertation, right? Working on it as we speak. And I'm wondering what you see for those of us who are shepherding these spaces that are helping our students make sense of their lived experience, make sense of their experiences in the classroom, that frankly are facing an existential threat. Yeah. What do you see for us in positioning ourselves within the institution when the walls of academic freedom give us no protection?
I think the first thing to do is to look across the states and find out who else is in the same position. What's their history? What have their strategies been? What has worked for them? What has not? How does your situation here differ legally, institutionally, and figure that out? But it is a moment for alliances, and we can do that through professional organizations, or we can do it through producing new associative networks. But if you suffer it alone,
Yes.
you will not be successful. This is why I wrote that book on Antigone, because she wanted to do the whole thing by herself. She ended up in a cave, and it was not good.
No.
No, but seriously, you have to figure out where's my solidarity, before you decide your own strategy. What have those strategies been? What's working where? And how do you get together and get on Zoom, or find your way to get together people who are facing the same kinds of connections. I mean, I visited a group in Texas, and then I visited a group in Florida, and I started telling them about what each other was going through, and they were like, do you think you could connect us with each other?
Yep.
Why aren't you already connected? I mean, the worst thing we can do is to stay huddled in our little corners, feeling oppressed by this or that administration. These are national trends. We need national strategy. Or international, transnational. Anyway, sorry, that's not concrete enough, probably.
I mean,
It's important.
what is these days, right?
What is.
So, thank you.
You came here, that was a good move.
Hi, I'm Layla Kawar. I'm faculty member and the vice president of our AUP chapter.
Oh, great.
I would just like to thank you for all of the research you did on our institution to prepare for this talk.
Yes.
I'd also like to thank you for offering openness. Openness was very helpful for me in the sense of capaciousness, against walls, against categories, and I think it's so much more fruitful and productive than neutrality. And so I am going to start using that word as often as I can, and I thank you for that.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, I think neutrality is a way of stepping back from what I take to be the mission of the university to be a kind of experimental place for democratic debate and open inquiry, and a way of life that allows us to question authority and to rethink the presuppositions in which we live, and to listen even when it's really hard to listen. Please.
Hi. First of all, you're very cool. Thank you for talking.
I'm glad I'm still cool, you know.
Yeah, you are. So, like, I guess I have kind of like a loose thought, and I don't know if it like really forms into a question, but like, so I feel like kind of in the last few years, there's been like sort of like an appropriation of the rhetoric around like free speech and censorship by like especially like reactionary people who like want kind of the opposite of what I think a lot of us want. Like, I guess, what do we do with that? I feel like it's hard to like engage with that because I think we have like different definitions than them of what free speech is and like where the line is between freedom of speech and freedom from criticism. You know, Elon Musk calls himself a free speech absolutist. And so I don't know, it's weird because I think I don't always know how to like productively engage with that. They're using language that I agree with to advocate for things that I don't.
Yes. Well, there are many things to be said about that, especially because the highly conservative advocates of academic freedom who've been around for some time now believe that gender, women's studies, sexuality studies, race studies, African American studies, ethnic studies, that they're all ideological, and what they do in the classroom is indoctrinate. Or some of us in sexuality studies are understood to seduce. But the indoctrination thesis has suggested that in a classroom, students are asked to all have the same point of view and to pledge allegiance to a particular point of view, when in fact, if you've ever been in a gender and women's studies seminar lately, you know, it's pretty conflictual, right? I mean, people barely can find their way. Okay, so, and it's hard to hang in, right? When you have you just can't bear what that other person is saying. But that is the norm. It's and handling that is really the true educational problem. But I think we need to have more robust public defenses of the academic freedom that we favor, because once people once departments and units start getting shut down because they're considered ideological or indoctrinating in the name of academic freedom, then we do have a quite nefarious instrumentalization of academic freedom to deprive people of their freedom to pursue their academic work. So we need to expose that as a significant and dangerous contradiction, but we also need to put forward a robust understanding of academic freedom. So for instance, I've been really thrilled to see that the AAUP is taking stronger stances, right? Stronger and stronger stances. I mean, there was a time where I was not sure I could trust that organization, quite frankly. And I know that the censor doesn't work as strongly as it did in the past, but this is an organization that I think we need to think with and be part of, especially if we're faculty. We should be individual members, and we should be helping that organization to do the public-facing work that is so enormously important. But I think we need an academic freedom for our time. We need to reappropriate that. It's been taken, take it back. But as we know, I mean, Naomi Klein points this out, like there are some times when the other side is using our language and we get confused. Like how do we manage? Well, identify it, expose the destructive work it's doing, and put forth your own. And I think that this is really important.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This will be our last question.
Okay.
Hi there. Thank you for making it out here and for your talk. It's awesome. I just want to mention one thing I've really admired from your work that has helped me make sense of life in general has been the way you've highlighted the concept of the power of words, or certain words, and how they're used in certain contexts, like the word militant we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
So forgive me, I don't know exactly where it came from, but from a previous work you've done, you've talked about the notion of dangerousness being weaponized or used as a label put onto a person, an individual, or a group or community to help justify the sidestepping of standard legal protocol. I remember one of the examples you used was for individuals labeled as terror suspects after 9/11,
That's
and
right.
they were sent straight to Guantanamo Bay without trial.
That's right.
And that was justified because we've projected this concept of danger onto them, right? So as you were talking earlier about intra and extramural speech, just wondering what role does the word like danger have when we've placed it onto academic speech and in similar settings, whether it's within the boundaries of the universe or outside of it. So.
Yeah. Well, I think security might be the word that gets invoked when speech is shut down, right? Or when assemblies are shut down. Oh, yes, you have those rights, but we now have a security concern and we need to, and this is more important than your particular rights.
Right.
And we need to shut this down in the name of security. So if there's security, like secure from what? What is the danger? There's always a danger implied by the security discourse. What's interesting to me, I mean, first of all, let's just say this about security. Like at NYU, it's very clear, like, this is our property. This is our real estate. And, our real estate, we own this is property, you're allowed on, you're not. Kind of changing the whole idea of the campus as a shared space that actually blends in with the community and the public, right? So there's a lot of that kind of justification offered. But what I find really interesting is that when I was going to talk about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in France, and the mayoral office of Paris shut it down. I was on a panel. So they shut it down. And they said security. And I said, what is the problem? I mean, we're just having a discussion. We're not hurting anybody. We're not doing anything. And it took them a long time to confess that the opponents were going to come and do damage to the building. Right? The people who didn't want the conversation to take place were going to come and do damage to the building. And then it happened a second time, more recently, where someone said to a friend, well, you can't really come give your talk because there's a security issue and we just can't handle it. And the students could be hurt. And it's like, well, what does it mean that the students would be hurt? That they would be hurt or damaged by the speaker? And the actual reality is that the protesters against the speaker would possibly get in a brawl, or they would identify the students as being complicit with the positions that are being enunciated by the speaker, and that the students would be doxxed or harassed or followed, right? So it's gotten very convoluted, right? Where events are canceled, not just because the point of view is controversial, but because the opposition to the point of view is potentially violent.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But that's not named.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm starting to collect examples of this. Mm-hmm. It's not always named. And what's implied is that the point of view is dangerous and that it will cause violence, even if you are, I don't know, like me, a hopeless defender of nonviolence. A ridiculously idealistic defender of nonviolence, right? It's like, I'm still Hamas, whatever, You can't argue when you're being maligned or recruited in this way or that. But okay. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Points of view become dangerous when the consequences are not fully controllable or predictable. But we do live with dangerous ideas. And sometimes, I'm not a First Amendment absolutist. I do think that there are certain forms of speech that are threatening and that are degrading that do need to be limited. There's no question in my mind. But we have to be really attentive to the fact that those exceptions can be instrumentalized and patterns can be built from a series of exceptions that slowly and surely suppress the political speech of those who are trying to challenge a consensus in the name of freedom and justice. So anyway, thank you so much for your patience.